Sometimes grief drives us to the loneliest places, searching for peace we don't deserve. 61-year-old cowboy Roy Halstead has lost everything: his wife, his cattle, his will to fight. With his last dollars, he buys river land out west, a place to disappear. The house is crumbling, but the river runs clear. It's enough for a dying man. Then his horse refuses to drink. Day after day, Junebug backs away from the water like she senses something wrong. When Roy walks downstream, he discovers 6 bodies in the reeds, recent deaths the sheriff won't investigate. What starts as one man's retreat becomes a hunt for truth. What secret is worth killing for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The truck rattled over the cattle guard just after dawn, dust rising in a thin cloud behind it. Roy Halstead gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles pale against the worn leather. 61 years showed in every line of his face, in the permanent squint from decades under the sun, in the grey stubble he hadn't bothered to shave for a week. The trailer behind him carried everything he owned now: 1 horse, 2 duffel bags, a toolbox that had belonged to his father, and a cardboard box of things he couldn't bring himself to throw away. The road ahead narrowed to 2 ruts, cutting through sage and rabbit brush. No signs, no mailbox, just the way the realtor had described it. 5 miles past where most folks would bother looking. That suited Roy fine. He wasn't looking to be found. When the house came into view, he let the truck slow to a crawl. The photograph in the listing had been generous. What stood before him was more ruin than residence. A single-story ranch house with a sagging porch, half the shingles missing from the roof, windows so dirty they looked painted over. The wood siding had weathered to the color of old bone. A rusted water pump stood in the yard like a gravestone. But beyond the house, maybe 200 yards down a gentle slope, ran the river. Roy cut the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. The river caught the early light, turning silver between the cottonwoods. It moved steady and sure, the way rivers do, indifferent to whatever foolishness happened on its banks. He could hear it from here, a low, constant murmur that felt almost like company. He climbed out of the truck, his back protesting. Everything protested these days. The air smelled clean, sage and water and earth. No dust, no death. That was worth something. The porch steps groaned under his weight but held. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, the house was exactly what he expected. Empty rooms thick with dust, water stains on the ceiling, a brick fireplace with half its mortar crumbled away, a kitchen with a pump sink, 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom that might work if he could get the well pump running. It would do. It was all he needed, a place to exist until he stopped existing. That was the only plan he had left. Roy walked back outside and opened the trailer. Junebug stepped down carefully, her hooves clopping on the metal ramp. She was a buckskin mare, 15 years old, with a dark stripe down her back and intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than most people. She'd been Sarah's horse first. He ran his hand down Junebug's neck, feeling the warmth of her, the solid reality of another living thing. "Well, girl," he said quietly, "this is it. End of the road for us." Junebug's ears swiveled forward, taking in the new place. Roy led her to what had once been a corral. 3 sides of fence, still standing, wire sagging but intact enough. There was even a lean-to shelter that looked sound. He'd need to fix the fence, string new wire, but not today. Today, he just needed to stand still. He unloaded his things slowly, carrying them inside without ceremony. The duffel bags went in one bedroom, the toolbox in the kitchen. The cardboard box he set in the corner of the living room and didn't open. Inside was a wedding album, birthday cards in Sarah's handwriting, the pink scarf she'd worn to church every Sunday, and a photograph. That was the one he kept separate, in his shirt pocket, where he could feel it against his chest like a heartbeat that wasn't his own. The photograph showed Sarah at 45, 5 years before she died. She was standing in front of their barn, the barn that was gone now, blown into kindling by the same wind that took everything else. In the picture, she was smiling, her hand raised to shield her eyes from the sun. Laugh lines at the corners of her eyes. That was how he needed to remember her, smiling, alive, real, not the way he'd found her after the storm. Roy forced the memory back, but it came anyway. Always did. The dust storm had risen out of nowhere on a Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago. He'd been in town buying feed, and by the time he saw the black wall rolling across the prairie, it was too late to get home. The wind hit with the force of God's own anger. 80 miles an hour, they said later, carrying enough topsoil to bury a county. When it finally passed and he made it back to the ranch, the house was still standing, but the barn was matchsticks scattered across 2 acres. 23 head of cattle were dead, suffocated by the dust or killed by flying debris. And Sarah had been trying to get the horses into the stable. A piece of corrugated metal roofing, torn loose from somewhere, had caught her across the back of the head. The doctor said she didn't suffer. Roy didn't believe him. He believed she died trying to save the animals, which was exactly like her, and he believed she died because he wasn't there. Those were the only 2 truths that mattered. After that, the ranch wasn't a ranch anymore. It was a graveyard. He'd sold what remained. The land, the surviving cattle, the equipment, for less than it was worth because he needed to be gone. Needed to be anywhere that didn't echo with her voice. So here he was. Nowhere, at the end of a road nobody traveled, with a dying house and a river he couldn't see the bottom of. Over the next few days, Roy fell into something like routine. He woke at dawn from habit, not from any sense of purpose. Made coffee on a camp stove. Sat on the porch watching the light change. The house had no electricity, no phone line, no connection to anything. That was fine. Who would he call? He spent his time doing small repairs that didn't really matter. Nailed down loose boards. Swept out rooms that would just fill with dust again. Fixed the pump in the kitchen sink until water flowed. Rust red at first, then clearing. The work kept his hands busy, which was the point. If his hands were busy, his mind had less room to wander. Junebug had free range of the property. Roy had strung enough wire to keep her from wandering too far, but mostly she stayed close, grazing on the sparse grass near the house or standing in the shade of the cottonwoods. She seemed content, which was more than Roy could say for himself. On the 3rd day, he walked her down to the river. The bank was steep there, a 6-foot drop to the water's edge. Willow branches hung low, trailing in the current. The river was maybe 30 feet across, moving quick enough to ripple over stones, but not so fast you couldn't cross it if you needed to. The water looked clean, catching the sky's blue. Roy tested the footing on the bank, then led Junebug down. She followed without hesitation until her front hooves touched the wet stones at the water's edge. Then she stopped. Roy tugged gently on the lead rope. "Come on, girl. You must be thirsty." Junebug didn't move. Her ears flattened back slightly, and she took a step backward, away from the water. "Junebug." Roy kept his voice calm. Horses spooked easy, especially in new places. Maybe the current bothered her, or the way the light reflected off the surface. "It's just water. Same as home." But it wasn't the same as home. Nothing was. He led her back up the bank and tried a different spot, where the water pooled in a quiet eddy. Same result. Junebug would approach to within a few feet, then balk, pulling back against the rope with surprising strength. Roy gave up after the 3rd attempt. "Stubborn creature," he muttered, though there was no heat in it. He filled a bucket from the pump and set it in the corral. Junebug drank from that readily enough, draining the bucket dry. Over the next week, the pattern continued. Every day, Roy would lead Junebug to the river, trying different locations along the bank. Every day she refused to drink. She'd approach, sniff the air, and then back away with what Roy could only describe as distrust. It made no sense. The water looked fine, smelled fine. He'd drunk from it himself and felt no ill effects, but Junebug wouldn't touch it. Roy told himself it didn't matter. He had the well pump working well enough to keep her watered. Still, it nagged at him. Horses had instincts about things. They could sense storms before they arrived, could feel earthquakes before the ground started shaking. What was Junebug sensing that he couldn't? He tried not to think about it. Tried not to think about anything, really. That was the whole reason for coming here, to stop thinking, stop feeling, stop carrying the weight of what couldn't be changed. But the mind doesn't work that way. You can't will yourself empty. At night, lying on an air mattress in the back bedroom, Roy would pull out the photograph. Even in the dark, he knew every detail. Sarah's smile, the way she stood with her weight on her left hip, the barn behind her, solid and permanent seeming. All of it gone now, except this small rectangle of glossy paper. "I'm sorry," he'd whisper to the darkness. "Sorry for not being there. Sorry for surviving when she didn't. Sorry for running away instead of staying to properly grieve. Sorry for ending up here in this broken-down house at the edge of nothing, waiting to die like some wounded animal that crawls off to do it alone." The photograph never answered. Sarah was frozen at 45 forever, smiling in the sunshine, knowing nothing of the storm that would come 5 years later. During the days, Roy explored the property more thoroughly. The land deed said he owned 40 acres, stretching from the county road down to the river and following the riverbank for about a quarter mile. Most of it was scrub, sage, greasewood, scattered junipers twisted by wind. Not good for much except looking at. He found the remains of an old fence line, posts rotted and wire rusted to nothing. Found a concrete foundation where some other structure had stood once. Maybe a barn or bunkhouse, long since collapsed or carried off. Found tin cans so old the labels had weathered away to nothing. Someone had lived here before him, had their own dreams and plans. What happened to them? Did they leave by choice, or did the land drive them out? The river was the only constant, flowing through it all, indifferent to human plans. Roy found himself spending more time near it, sitting on the bank in the late afternoon when the heat started to ease. The sound of it was almost hypnotic, that steady rush of water over stone, the occasional splash of a fish, the whisper of wind through the willows. Sometimes he'd see birds, herons standing patient in the shallows, ducks paddling in the eddies. Once a bald eagle perched in a dead cottonwood, surveying its domain with regal indifference. Life went on here, regardless of his presence or absence. That should have been comforting, but instead it just made him feel more invisible, more irrelevant. 2 weeks after his arrival, Roy was sitting on the porch at sunset when he heard a truck on the road. He tensed. He hadn't seen or spoken to another human being since he'd arrived, which had been entirely the point. The truck slowed as it approached, then turned into his driveway. Roy stood watching as a white pickup pulled to a stop. The door opened, and a man about Roy's age climbed out, wearing a clean shirt, pressed jeans, and a badge on his belt. "Evening," the man called out, friendly enough. "You must be Halstead." "I'm Sheriff Tom Dawkins." Roy nodded but didn't move from the porch. "Sheriff, just wanted to stop by. Welcome you to the county." Dawkins had the easy manner of someone used to being in charge without having to prove it. "Make sure you're settling in, okay? It's pretty remote out here. That's why I bought it." "Fair enough." Dawkins glanced around at the property, his eyes taking in the sad state of the house. The patched corral, Junebug grazing in the distance. "You need anything?" "Town's about 40 minutes south. General store, diner, post office." "Not much, but we've got the basics." "I'm fine." There was a pause. Dawkins seemed to be weighing whether to say something else. Finally he did. "Look, I know you probably came out here to be left alone, and I respect that. But if you do need something, or if you see anything unusual, don't hesitate to come find me. Town's not big enough to miss the sheriff's office." "Unusual like what?" Dawkins shrugged. "Oh, trespassers, strange vehicles, that sort of thing. We get drifters sometimes, folks passing through. Usually harmless, but it doesn't hurt to be careful. I'll keep that in mind." "All right, then." Dawkins tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, Mr. Halstead." Roy watched the truck drive away, a small knot forming in his chest. The sheriff seemed pleasant enough, but the visit felt off somehow, like a warning dressed up as hospitality. Or maybe Roy was just so used to isolation now that any human contact felt wrong. He went inside, trying to shake off the unease. It was nothing, just a sheriff doing his job, checking on a newcomer. Normal behavior in a small county, but that night, Roy couldn't sleep. He lay in the darkness, listening to the river's distant murmur, and thought about Sheriff Dawkins' words. "If you see anything unusual." What would count as unusual out here? What was the sheriff actually warning him about? And why, when Dawkins had looked around the property, had his eyes lingered on the river? Roy pulled out the photograph again, holding it close. "What am I doing here, Sarah?" he whispered. "What am I looking for?" The answer, when it came, wasn't from the photograph. It was from deeper inside himself, from a part he'd been trying to ignore. He wasn't looking for anything. He was hiding, from grief, from guilt, from the responsibility of going on living when the person he loved was gone. But maybe, just maybe, life wasn't done with him yet. The next morning, Roy woke with a strange sense of purpose. He couldn't name it, couldn't explain it. He just knew that something was wrong with this place, not with the house or the land, but with something bigger. Junebug knew it. The sheriff's visit hinted at it. And now, finally, Roy was ready to stop hiding and start paying attention. He led Junebug to the river again. Same result. She refused to drink, backing away with her ears flattened. Roy stood there for a long moment, studying the water. It looked clear, looked clean, but looking wasn't knowing. "All right, girl," he said quietly. "I hear you. Something's not right." He decided then that he'd follow the river, walk downstream, see what he could see. Maybe there was a dead animal fouling the water upstream. Maybe there was runoff from somewhere. Maybe there was nothing at all, and Junebug was just being difficult. But Roy didn't think so. And for the first time since Sarah died, he found himself curious about something other than his own grief. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow, he'd walk the riverbank and see where it led. Tonight, he'd rest and gather his strength. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would change everything, that what he found downstream would pull him out of his grief and thrust him into something far more dangerous. That his simple plan to die quietly in this forgotten place would be replaced by a fight for justice he never asked for. Sometimes life doesn't let you hide. Sometimes it finds you anyway, and demands you be more than you thought you had left to give. Roy went to sleep that night with Sarah's photograph on the floor beside his mattress, her smile watching over him as the river flowed on in the darkness, carrying its secrets downstream. Roy set out just after sunrise, when the air was still cool and the light lay gold across the sage. He wore his work boots, an old canvas jacket, and his hat pulled low against the sun. Junebug watched from the corral as he walked past, and he could have sworn there was something like approval in her eyes. The riverbank wasn't easy walking. Willows and cottonwoods grew thick in places, their roots making a tangle underfoot. In other stretches, the bank rose steep and rocky, forcing Roy to climb inland and circle around. His knees complained, his back complained. He ignored them both. At 61, everything complained. You either listened to it and stopped moving, or you kept going. He kept going. He'd walked maybe half a mile when the character of the river changed. The current slowed, pooling in a wide bend where the far bank cut away in a deep curve. Reeds grew thick here, cattails standing 8 feet tall in the shallows. The water was darker, almost stagnant, and there was a smell, faint but unmistakable. Rot. Decay. Something wrong. Roy stopped at the top of the bank, his stomach tightening. He knew that smell. Every rancher knew it. Death had a particular scent, sweet and sour at once, and it hung in the air here like an accusation. He made his way down carefully, using exposed roots for handholds. At the water's edge, he pushed through the outer reeds, their dry stalks rattling against his jacket. The smell grew stronger. He pressed his bandana over his nose and mouth and kept going. That was when he saw the first one, a hand, grey, white and bloated, fingers spread as if reaching for something. It protruded from the reeds about 10 feet from shore, where the current had pushed it into the tangle of stems and roots. Roy's breath caught. He forced himself forward, pushing aside more reeds, and the full horror of it revealed itself. 6 bodies. 6 men, from what he could tell, though the water and time had done their work. They were tangled together in the reeds like driftwood, their clothes torn and waterlogged, their faces. Roy looked away from their faces. Some things you didn't need to see in detail to understand. These weren't old deaths. The bodies hadn't been here long. Days, maybe a couple of weeks at most. They hadn't been in the water long enough to fully decompose, which somehow made it worse. They were still recognizable as people. As men who had lived and breathed and hoped for things. Roy stepped back, his boots squelching in the mud. His heart hammered in his chest. For a moment he thought he might be sick. Then the rancher's instinct took over, the part of him that had dealt with death in practical terms his whole life. Animals died. People died. You didn't fall apart about it. You handled it. He moved closer again, trying to assess what he was looking at. The men were young, mostly, 20s or 30s, dark-haired. Their clothes were work clothes, denim canvas, heavy boots. Working men, laborers. One of them had a bandana tied around his neck, red fabric gone muddy. Another wore a watch that still glinted on his wrist. Roy's eye caught something on the nearest body, a badge pinned to the shirt pocket. He leaned in, careful not to touch anything, and read the faded printing, Clearwater Mining Co. Below that, a number, 2847, a mine worker. That made sense. There was mining all through this country, copper, silver, some gold. Men came west looking for wages, often from Mexico or further south. They worked dangerous jobs for little pay and less protection. Sometimes they got hurt, sometimes they died, but 6 men in the same stretch of river, all wearing work clothes, all looking like they died around the same time. That wasn't an accident. That was something else. Roy backed away from the reeds, his mind working. What had happened here? A mining accident that washed them downstream. A flood. But the river wasn't that deep or that fast. It would take force to drown 6 grown men. And why were there no reports? Surely someone missed 6 workers, unless no one knew. Unless no one cared to look. Roy stood on the bank for a long time, staring at the dark water, feeling the weight of what he'd found settle onto his shoulders. He'd come here to escape, to hide, to let the world go on without him. But the world had other ideas. The world had put 6 dead men in his river, and now he had to decide what to do about it. The decent thing, the only thing, really, was to report it. Let the authorities handle it. Let them identify the bodies, notify families, investigate what happened. That was their job, not his. He could tell the sheriff, walk away, go back to his quiet dying in peace. But even as he thought it, Roy knew he wouldn't. Something in him had shifted when he saw those bodies. They reminded him of cattle left to die in a storm, forgotten and unmourned. They reminded him of Sarah, lying in the dust because he wasn't there. They reminded him that choosing not to care was its own kind of death. He took one more look at the scene, fixing it in his memory, then turned and made his way back upstream. His legs felt shaky. His hands trembled slightly. He was too old for this, too tired, too broken. But he was also the only one who knew. And sometimes knowing meant you had to act, whether you wanted to or not. The walk back seemed longer. Roy's mind kept replaying what he'd seen, trying to make sense of it. 6 bodies, mining badges, young men who should have been at the beginning of their lives, not tangled dead in a riverbank. What had they done wrong except show up looking for work? By the time he reached his property, the sun was high and hot. Junebug stood in the shade of the lean-to, watching him approach. Roy went to her first, running his hand along her neck, taking comfort in her solid warmth. "You knew, didn't you?" he murmured. "You knew something was wrong with that water." He saddled Junebug and rode into town, the 40-minute drive taking almost 2 hours on horseback. He could have taken the truck, but he needed the time to think, to steady himself. The motion of riding, the rhythm of it helped clear his head. The town was called Copper Wells, though Roy doubted there was any copper left in the ground. Main Street ran 6 blocks, a general store, a diner, a hardware shop, a post office, a bar, and the sheriff's office. There were houses scattered on the side streets, most of them small and weathered. The whole place had an air of hanging on, of surviving without quite thriving. Roy tied Junebug outside the sheriff's office and went in. A young deputy sat at the front desk, looking half asleep. He straightened when Roy entered. "Help you, sir?" "Need to see Sheriff Dawkins." "It's important. He's in his office." "I'll tell him you're here." "Name?" "Roy Halstead." "He'll know me." The deputy disappeared through a door and returned a moment later, gesturing Roy back. Dawkins sat behind a desk piled with papers, a coffee cup in one hand, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. He stood when Roy entered, though, offering his hand. "Mr. Halstead, didn't expect to see you again so soon. What can I do for you?" Roy sat without being invited. "I found bodies. 6 of them. In the river on my property." Dawkins' expression didn't change much. Just a slight tightening around the eyes. "Bodies, 6 men. Been in the water maybe a week or 2. They're tangled in the reeds about half a mile downstream from my house. You touch anything?" "No, but I got close enough to see one was wearing a mining company badge. Clearwater Mining." Now Dawkins reacted, setting down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Clearwater." He said it like a curse. "You sure?" "I can read." Badge was clear enough. The sheriff sat back in his chair, his jaw working like he was chewing something tough. Finally he sighed. "All right. I'll send someone out to take a look. Can you show us where? I can draw you a map. Or I can meet you there." "Map's fine." Dawkins pushed a notepad and pencil across the desk. "I appreciate you reporting this, Mr. Halstead, but I want to give you some advice. This kind of thing, dead workers, mine company, it gets complicated. These men were probably illegals, transients. No families to claim them, no records of them even being here. Sometimes the best thing is to let the proper authorities handle it and not get involved." Roy looked up from the notepad. "I'm reporting it to the proper authorities." "That's you, right, and I'll handle it. What I'm saying is, don't go digging into this on your own. Don't go asking questions. Companies like Clearwater, they've got lawyers, connections. They don't like attention. And small-time ranchers who make waves have a way of finding life gets harder. Are you telling me not to care that 6 men are dead in my river? I'm telling you to be smart." Dawkins leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Look, I know you're new here and you seem like a decent man. But this county runs on mining. Always has. When the mines do well, we all do well. When they don't, people lose jobs. 6 dead workers is a tragedy, sure. But dragging it out, making it a scandal, that hurts a lot of living people. You understand what I'm saying?" Roy understood perfectly. The sheriff was telling him to look the other way, to let 6 men stay forgotten because remembering them was inconvenient, to value economics over justice, profit over dignity. He finished the map and slid it across the desk. "I understand that 6 men are dead and somebody should care about it. I'll expect you to investigate properly, Sheriff. And I'll be checking to make sure you do." Dawkins' expression hardened. "You do what you feel you need to, Mr. Halstead, but remember what I said. Some fights aren't worth fighting." Roy stood, his chair scraping loud in the quiet office. "When you get to be my age, Sheriff, you realize all the fights are worth fighting, especially the ones you've been avoiding." He walked out without waiting for a response, untied Junebug, and started the long ride home. His hands weren't shaking anymore. His mind felt clear. He'd come to this place to die quietly, to surrender to grief and let it take him slow. But that was over now. Those 6 men in the reeds deserved better than to be dismissed as inconvenient. They deserved truth, justice, and someone to stand up and demand it for them. Roy might be old and tired and broken. He might be running from his own demons. But he could still do this one thing. He could still care when caring mattered. And if that fight cost him the peace he'd been seeking, so be it. Some kinds of peace weren't worth having. 3 days passed with no word from Sheriff Dawkins. No follow-up visit, no phone call, though Roy had no phone to receive one. Just silence, which was its own kind of answer. On the 4th day, Roy rode back into Copper Wells. This time he headed straight for the diner, a place called Betty's, with a hand-painted sign and gingham curtains in the windows. If you wanted to know what was really happening in a small town, you didn't ask the sheriff. You asked the waitress. The lunch crowd was thin. 2 men at the counter nursing coffee, an elderly woman in a corner booth picking at pie. Roy took a seat at the counter and waited. A woman in her 50s came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her name tag read Betty. "What can I get you?" Her voice was pleasant but guarded, the tone of someone who'd learned not to trust strangers too quickly. "Coffee, thanks. And maybe some information." Betty poured the coffee without comment, set it in front of him. "Information cost extra." Roy added sugar to the coffee, stirred it slowly. "I'm living out on the old Ferguson place. Bought it a few weeks back. Heard about that. Remote spot. That's what I wanted. But I found something out there I didn't want. 6 bodies in the river. Betty's hand froze halfway to the coffee pot. The 2 men at the counter went very still. Even the old woman in the booth stopped eating, her fork suspended in the air. You reported that to the sheriff? Betty's voice had gone flat. I did. 3 days ago. Haven't heard back. Betty set down the coffee pot carefully like it might explode. Look, Mr. Halstead, is it? Some things around here are better left alone. If the sheriff says he'll handle it, he'll handle it. Will he? Because it seems like 6 dead men ought to get more than 3 days of silence. One of the men at the counter stood abruptly, dropped a few bills on the counter, and walked out. The other followed a moment later. The bell above the door chimed twice, leaving Roy and Betty in uneasy quiet. Betty leaned across the counter, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You want my advice? Drop this. Go back to your property and mind your business. Those men are my business now. They're on my land. They're not the first. Won't be the last. She said it like a confession, like something she'd been carrying for too long. Roy set down his coffee cup. What do you mean, not the first? Betty glanced toward the kitchen, then back at Roy. Her face was lined with worry, with the weight of knowing things she couldn't say. The mining company upstream, Clearwater, they hire workers, usually fellows who come from somewhere else looking for wages. Sometimes those workers leave without collecting their pay. Sometimes they just disappear. People talk, but talking doesn't do much good around here. How long has this been going on? Year, maybe longer. Nobody knows for sure. Nobody wants to know for sure. She straightened up, putting professional distance back between them. That coffee's on the house. But I can't help you more than that. I've got a business to run and bills to pay. Roy understood. Fear had a way of making practical people out of everyone. He thanked her and left, but he didn't head home. Instead, he walked Main Street, studying the town with new eyes. How many people here knew what was happening? How many turned away because it was easier than standing up? How many had families to feed and mortgages to pay and couldn't afford to be heroes? He thought about his own life, all the times he'd done the same thing. Neighbors who treated their horses badly. Not bad enough to report, he'd told himself, just not good. Ranch hands paid under the table with no insurance, no rights. Sarah had wanted him to say something. She'd pushed him to do the right thing, and he'd always found a reason not to get involved. It's not our business, he'd told her once, after she'd suggested they report a rancher who was clearly abusing his livestock. We keep our heads down. We get along. She'd looked at him with disappointment he could still feel 3 years after her death. That's how evil wins, Roy. Good people looking the other way. He'd brushed it off. Made excuses. And now here he was, 61 years old, and finally understanding what she'd been trying to teach him. Looking away didn't make you innocent. It made you complicit. Roy returned to Junebug and rode north, following the dirt roads that paralleled the river. After an hour he saw it, the mining camp. It wasn't much. A collection of trailers and prefab buildings behind a chain-link fence, with a guard shack at the entrance. A sign read, Clearwater Mining Company, authorized personnel only. Dust hung in the air from heavy trucks moving in and out. Roy could hear the sound of machinery, the beeping of vehicles backing up, men shouting in Spanish. This wasn't a small operation. Clearwater was pulling serious material out of the ground. He didn't approach the gate. Just sat on Junebug at a distance watching. After a while, a pickup truck emerged and headed toward town. Roy followed at a distance, curious. The truck stopped at a small market on the edge of Copper Wells. A man climbed out, late 20s, Hispanic, wearing work clothes covered in dust. Roy dismounted and followed him inside. The store was dim and cramped, shelves stocked with canned goods and dry goods. The man was buying water, stacking bottles in a shopping basket. Roy approached casually, picking up a can of beans he didn't need. Excuse me, you work at Clearwater? The man looked up, wary. Who's asking? My name's Roy Halstead. I live downstream from the mine. I'm wondering about some men who might have worked there. 6 of them. The man's face went pale. He set down his basket and started for the door. Wait, Roy said. Please, I just want to know if anyone's missing. If anyone's looking for them. The man stopped at the door, but didn't turn around. You don't ask those questions. Not if you want to keep breathing. I found them. In the river. They deserve to be identified. Their families deserve to know. Now the man turned and Roy saw real fear in his eyes. They have no families, not here. That's why Clearwater hires them. No one to ask questions. No one to complain. You understand? This is how it works. It shouldn't work that way. No, it shouldn't. The man's voice was bitter. But what are you going to do? One old man against a company with money, with lawyers, with people who don't care how many of us die, as long as the copper keeps coming out of the ground? He walked out, leaving Roy standing alone in the dim store. The clerk behind the counter was studiously avoiding eye contact. Roy paid for the beans and left. On the ride home, Roy's mind churned. 6 men dead. How many others had there been? How many more would there be if nothing changed? And what could one old rancher do against a system designed to exploit and discard? The answer came to him slowly, not in a flash of inspiration, but in the steady rhythm of Junebug's hooves on the dirt road. He couldn't save those 6 men. They were already gone. But he could make sure they weren't forgotten. He could make sure their deaths meant something. He could demand justice, even if justice came slow and hard. Sarah had spent her whole life fighting small battles, for fairness, for dignity, for doing right even when it cost you. Roy had loved her for it, while secretly thinking she was naive. The world didn't work that way, he'd believed. The world rewarded the strong and crushed the weak, and trying to change it was like trying to stop the river with your bare hands. But maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe Sarah hadn't been naive. Maybe she'd been brave in a way he'd never understood. And maybe now, at the end of his life, Roy could finally learn what she'd been trying to teach him. When he got home, he found something that made his blood run cold. A piece of paper folded and tucked under the front door. He opened it with shaking hands. The message was simple, written in block capitals. Mind your business or end up like them. Roy stood on his porch, the note trembling in his hand. So it wasn't an accident. Those men hadn't drowned. They'd been killed. And whoever killed them knew that Roy had found them. Knew he was asking questions. The smart thing would be to stop. Take the warning. Go back to his plan of dying quietly in this forgotten place. He'd lived 61 years by being smart, by avoiding trouble, by keeping his head down. But for the first time in those 61 years, Roy Halstead decided to be stupid. He decided to stand up. He decided that 6 dead men he'd never met were worth more than his own safety. He went inside, dug through his cardboard box, and found Sarah's letter, the one she'd written him on their 20th anniversary. He read it again, his eyes finding the passage he remembered. Standing up for what's right is never wrong, even when it costs us. I'd rather live 1 year doing right than 100 years looking away. She'd lived 49 years total. 29 of them with him, and she'd spent them all trying to make him braver, better, stronger than he thought he could be. "All right, Sarah," Roy whispered to the empty house. "I'm listening now. I'm finally listening." He folded the letter carefully, put it back in his pocket next to her photograph, and began to plan his next move. If the sheriff wouldn't investigate, Roy would. If the town was too scared to act, Roy would act alone. If there was a price to pay for pursuing justice, he'd pay it. He'd already lost everything that mattered. What more could they take? The next morning, Roy found a mason jar in the kitchen cupboard and walked to the river. The water looked the same as always, clear enough on the surface, moving steady over the stones. But Junebug's refusal to drink kept nagging at him. Horses knew things. They sensed danger before it showed itself. He filled the jar about 100 yards upstream from where he'd found the bodies, screwing the lid tight. The water looked clean in the glass, just faintly cloudy. But when he lifted it to his nose, he caught something underneath the earth smell. Something chemical, faint, but there, like the ghost of copper pennies, or the sharp bite of bleach. Roy had no way to test it properly, but he didn't need a laboratory to tell him something was wrong. He filled 2 more jars, one from right by his property, another from a spot even further upstream. He labeled them with dates and locations, using a marker from his toolbox, then lined them up on his kitchen counter like evidence, which is what they were. He spent the afternoon walking the riverbank north, following it back toward the mining camp. The terrain grew rougher, rockier with less vegetation. And the smell grew stronger. That same chemical tang, getting sharper the closer he got to Clearwater's operation. About a mile from the camp's perimeter, Roy found it. A culvert pipe, maybe 2 feet in diameter, jutting out from the bank above the waterline. During dry times, it would have been completely exposed, but with the spring runoff, it was partially submerged. Dark liquid trickled from it, mixing with the river water in oily swirls. Roy's stomach turned. This wasn't accidental runoff. This was deliberate dumping. They were piping waste directly into the river, probably during night shifts when no one would see. And the men who'd discovered it, who'd maybe threatened to report it, they'd ended up in the reeds downstream. Roy was turning to head back when he heard a voice behind him. "You shouldn't be here." He spun around. A man stood about 20 feet away, having approached silent as smoke. He was young, mid-20s, with dark hair and wary eyes. Thin, like he'd been missing meals. His clothes were work clothes, stained and worn, and his hands were rough with labor. "I'm just walking," Roy said, keeping his voice calm. "This is open land, not open. Company land. They'll shoot you for trespassing. You work for Clearwater?" The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I did for 3 months. Until I got smart. Smart how?" The man studied Roy for a long moment, deciding something. Finally, he said, "You're the one who found them. The bodies. How do you know that?" "Everyone at the camp knows." "Word spreads fast. The company knows too. That's why you need to leave." Roy gestured to the culvert pipe. "What's coming out of there?" "Tailings. Chemical waste from processing. Acid, heavy metals, God knows what else. They're supposed to treat it, store it proper. But that costs money. Easier to dump it in the river at night when nobody's watching." "How long has this been going on?" "Since I started working there. Probably before. They told us it was legal, that they had permits. Some of us believed it. Some of us didn't care. We needed the work." The man's voice was bitter. "Then guys started getting sick. Stomach problems, rashes, breathing trouble. Company doctor said it was the flu, but it wasn't the flu. And the men who died?" The man looked away toward the river. "Some of them were going to report it. To environmental people, labor board, whoever would listen. Company found out. Next thing, they're gone. Disappeared. Everyone at the camp got the message real clear. What's your name?" Roy asked. "Miguel. That's all you need to know. Miguel, those men deserve justice. They deserve to be alive." Miguel's voice rose sharp with anger and grief. "But they're not. And getting yourself killed won't change that. The company has this whole county in their pocket. Sheriff, judges, everyone. You think one old man can change anything?" Roy felt the weight of those words. Miguel was probably right. One man against that kind of power. It was foolish, suicidal even. But Roy was tired of being smart. Tired of calculating odds and choosing safety. He'd spent a lifetime doing that, and it had gotten him exactly nowhere. His wife was dead. His old life was ash. The only thing he had left was the choice of how to spend his remaining days. And he could either spend them hiding or he could spend them fighting. "Maybe I can't change anything," Roy said slowly, "but I can try. I can make noise. I can refuse to let those men be forgotten." Miguel shook his head. "You're crazy, probably. But I'm also the only one who seems willing to do anything. Will you help me?" "Help you how? Testify? Get myself killed?" "Just tell me what you know." "Who was in charge? How it worked? Give me enough to take to someone outside this county, someone the company doesn't own." Miguel was quiet for a long time, staring at the toxic water trickling into the river. Finally he said, "There's a foreman, Victor Caldwell. He runs the night operations. He's the one who gives the orders, what to dump, when to dump it. He's the one who made people disappear. Can you identify him?" "I can do better than that. I can show you where they keep the records. There's a trailer at the camp, office trailer. Caldwell keeps a logbook of everything, how much they dump, when, all of it. He's paranoid about getting caught, so he documents everything to cover himself. If you could get that logbook, that's evidence. That's a death sentence for whoever tries to take it. Those trailers are locked, guarded. You'd have to be insane to try." Roy almost smiled. "Lucky for both of us, I'm not too concerned about staying alive." Miguel studied him with something like respect. "You really mean this?" "I really do." "Then meet me tomorrow night." 10 o'clock, by the old grain elevator south of town. I'll draw you a map of the camp layout, show you where the office is. But after that, you're on your own. I've got family in Mexico who need me alive. I understand. And Miguel, thank you. The young man nodded once and melted back into the brush, silent as he'd come. Roy stood alone by the culvert, watching poison flow into the water. He thought about those 6 men, working for wages, believing in the promise of something better. They died because they tried to do right, because they'd threatened to expose corruption, and now Roy was following in their footsteps, which made him either brave or stupid. Probably stupid. Definitely stupid. But there was a kind of freedom in it. When you'd already lost everything, fear lost its power. He collected one more water sample from right by the culvert, this one showing the contamination clearly, an oily sheen on the surface, a smell that made his eyes water. Then he headed home, his mind already working through the logistics. If he was going to break into a mining company office, he'd need to plan it carefully. He was old, not invisible. That night, Roy sat at his kitchen table with the 3 jars of water in front of him. The difference was stark. The jar from upstream by the culvert was visibly contaminated. The one from his property showed traces. The one further downstream, where he'd found the bodies, was worse, concentrated by days of accumulation. He thought about Junebug, refusing to drink. She'd known. Animals always knew. They didn't rationalize or make excuses. They just trusted their instincts. Maybe Roy should have trusted his own instincts earlier. The ones that told him Sheriff Dawkins was lying. That told him this whole situation stank of cover-up. There was a knock at the door, sharp and sudden in the quiet night. Roy's hand went instinctively to the rifle he'd started keeping by the door. He moved carefully, peering out the window first. A woman stood on the porch, 40 or so, with dark hair pulled back, wearing jeans and a practical jacket. She didn't look like a threat, but Roy had learned that threats came in all forms. He opened the door, but kept his hand near the rifle. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Halstead. My name is Ellen Graves. I'm a journalist. I heard you found bodies in the river. I'd like to talk to you about that." Roy studied her. "How did you hear about it?" "Small town. News travels. Can I come in?" Every instinct told Roy to send her away. Getting a journalist involved meant escalating things beyond any hope of quiet resolution. It meant making this public, making this real. It meant crossing a line he couldn't uncross. But then again, he'd already crossed that line when he decided to investigate. And maybe a journalist was exactly what he needed. Someone with the tools and connections to expose what was happening here. Someone who could make noise loud enough to be heard outside this corrupted county. Roy stepped aside. "Come in. I'll make coffee." Ellen Graves stepped into his house, and Roy closed the door behind her, sealing his fate. He was committed now. No going back. He'd made his choice. Stand up and fight whatever it cost. Sarah would have been proud. That thought gave him more comfort than 100 years of safe, silent living ever could. The war had begun. Roy Halstead, 61-year-old widower who'd come here to die quietly, was going to war against a mining company, a corrupt sheriff, and a system designed to crush anyone who challenged it. He probably wouldn't win, but at least he wouldn't die, wondering what would have happened if he'd been brave. Ellen Graves wasn't what Roy expected. She had the tiredness of someone who'd been fighting battles too long, and a directness he appreciated. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I tried to expose Clearwater 5 years ago," she said, cradling the coffee cup in both hands. "I was working for a paper in Phoenix then. Got a tip that workers were dying at their operations here. Did 6 months of research, interviewed families, gathered documents, had everything I needed for a story that would shut them down. What happened? My editor killed it, said the sources weren't reliable, the evidence was circumstantial. But I knew the truth. Clearwater's parent company advertises heavily in the paper. They made it clear the ads would disappear if the story ran. My editor chose advertising revenue over truth." She took a sip of coffee, her expression bitter. "I quit the next day, started freelancing. But without a major paper behind me, nobody would publish what I had. So you've been sitting on this story for 5 years. Sitting on it, adding to it, waiting for something that would force it into the open. And then I heard about you. 6 bodies. A witness who's willing to talk. This might be the break I need. Roy leaned back in his chair. What do you know about how they operate? Ellen pulled a folder from her bag, spreading papers across the table. Clearwater Mining Company is a subsidiary of a larger corporation based in Delaware. They have operations in 7 states. The business model is simple. Move into economically depressed areas, extract resources as cheaply as possible, leave when it's no longer profitable. They don't care about environmental damage or worker safety. They care about profit margins. She pulled out a document, a contract, several pages long, densely printed. This is a standard worker contract. I got it from a family whose son died at one of their sites in Arizona. Look at page 3, Roy read where she pointed. The language was complex, clearly written by lawyers, but the meaning was clear enough. Workers waived all rights to sue the company. They accepted all risks. They acknowledged that they were employed at will, with no guarantee of safety measures. And at the bottom, in smaller print, this contract is binding regardless of the worker's understanding of its terms. They give these to men who barely speak English, Ellen said. Men who are desperate for work. Some of them can't even read. They sign because they need the money to send home to families. And once they sign, they have zero legal protection. That can't be legal, it's barely legal. But Clearwater has lawyers who know exactly how far they can push. And they target undocumented workers specifically because those men won't report violations. They can't go to the police without risking deportation. They can't sue without exposing their immigration status. Clearwater created a system where their workers have no recourse, no voice, no rights. Roy felt sick. He'd spent his life thinking the world was basically fair, that if you worked hard and followed the rules, things would work out. But this was systematic exploitation. This was evil done with contracts and lawyers and paperwork. How many have died? He asked. That I can confirm? 18 over the last 8 years. But I think the real number is much higher. Some bodies are never found. Some deaths are ruled accidents. Some families never come forward because they're afraid. The 6 you found, those are just the ones who surfaced. Ellen pulled out another document, a spreadsheet covered in handwritten notes. I've been tracking patterns. Every time there's an incident, a death, an injury, a near miss that almost gets reported, Clearwater does the same thing. They pay off the local sheriff to make it go away. They intimidate witnesses, and if that doesn't work, people disappear. You're saying Sheriff Dawkins is on their payroll. I can't prove it. Not yet, but I've tracked his finances as much as public records allow. 3 years ago he was struggling. House in foreclosure, credit card debt. Then suddenly he's flush. New truck, paid off his mortgage, sends his daughter to a private college. On a sheriff's salary? The math doesn't add up. Roy thought about his meeting with Dawkins, the way the sheriff had tried to discourage him from pursuing this. Not just discouragement, it was a warning. Stay out of it. Don't make trouble. He's protecting them, Roy said. He's protecting himself. Clearwater pays him to look the other way. And it's not just him. The county commissioner, the judge, the head of the local union, they're all benefiting somehow. Clearwater spreads money around, makes sure everyone in power has a reason to stay quiet. What about state authorities? Federal. That's where you come in, Ellen said, leaning forward. I can write the story. I have the background, the research, the context. But without new evidence, recent evidence, it's just old news. The 6 bodies you found change everything. That's fresh. That's undeniable. If we can connect those deaths directly to Clearwater's operations, prove they were murdered to silence them, we can force a federal investigation. The EPA, FBI, both, but we need evidence they can't ignore. Photos of the bodies, water samples showing contamination, testimony from workers, company documents proving they knew about the dumping. Can you get any of that? Roy thought about Miguel, about the logbook in Victor Caldwell's office. I might be able to get company records, but it's risky. Everything about this is risky. These people have killed before. They'll kill again if they think you're a threat. Ellen's eyes were steady on his. I need to know you understand what you're getting into. This isn't like standing up to a crooked businessman. This is taking on a system. People who cross Clearwater have a way of suffering accidents. Houses burn down, cars run off roads. Witnesses change their stories or disappear entirely. You're trying to scare me off. I'm trying to make sure you know the stakes. You're 61 years old, Mr. Halstead. You could walk away from this. Go back to your quiet life. Nobody would blame you. Roy was quiet for a moment, thinking about Sarah, about the years he'd spent avoiding confrontation, about all the small injustices he'd ignored because they weren't his problem. My wife used to say that the world breaks down when good people do nothing. I didn't understand what she meant. I thought she was being dramatic, but she was right. 6 men are dead because people like me look the other way. So you'll help? I'll help. But I need your word on something. What? If this goes bad, if I end up like those men in the river, you make sure their story gets told. You make sure people know their names, know what happened to them. They deserve that much, Helen nodded slowly. You have my word, but let's try to keep you alive long enough to see justice done. She stayed for another hour, going through what she knew, what she needed, how to safely document evidence. She gave Roy a prepaid cell phone and her number, showed him how to take photos that would hold up as evidence, explained chain of custody and how to preserve water samples properly. When she finally left, driving away in a battered sedan, Roy sat alone in his house feeling the weight of what he'd agreed to. He was in this now, fully committed. He'd crossed from being a witness to being an investigator, from being a bystander to being a participant, and there was no going back. He pulled out Sarah's photograph, studying her smile in the lamplight. I hope I'm doing the right thing, he whispered. I'd hope this is what you would have wanted. The photograph didn't answer, but in the silence, Roy felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the guilt he'd carried for 3 years. Maybe this was how he honored her memory, not by dying in grief, but by living with purpose. Not by giving up, but by standing up. Not by hiding from the world, but by fighting to make it a little better. Outside, the river flowed on in the darkness, carrying its poison downstream. Somewhere, families waited for news of sons and brothers who would never come home. Somewhere, Victor Caldwell was planning his next dump of toxic waste. Somewhere, Sheriff Dawkins was counting his blood money. But here, in this broken-down house at the end of a forgotten road, one old man had decided enough was enough. Roy Halstead was going to war. And this time, he wasn't walking away. That night, Roy couldn't sleep. He lay on his air mattress, staring at the ceiling, his mind churning through memories he'd spent years trying to forget. Moments when he'd chosen safety over principle. Times when Sarah had stood up and he'd urged caution. All the small acts of cowardice that accumulated into a life of looking away. He remembered the summer before she died. Their neighbor, a rancher named Pete Simmons, had been hiring workers from the border, paying them half the legal wage, housing them in a shed without running water. Sarah had been furious when she found out. She'd wanted to report him to the labor board, maybe even contact advocacy groups. It's not right, Roy, she'd said, standing in their kitchen with that steel in her voice he'd loved and feared. Those men are living like animals. Pete's exploiting them because he knows they can't fight back. And Roy had said, God help him, he remembered every word, it's Pete's business how he runs his operation. We start making waves, we make enemies. We've got to live here, Sarah. We've got to get along. She looked at him with such disappointment. Is that what matters to you? Getting along? Being liked? What about doing right? I am doing right. I'm taking care of us, making sure we keep our ranch, pay our bills, have a future. That's my responsibility. Your responsibility is to be a decent human being. Everything else comes second. They'd fought about it for a week. In the end, Sarah had reported Pete Simmons anyway, without telling Roy. The labor board investigated. Pete was fined. The workers got paid what they were owed. And Pete never spoke to them again. Made it clear around town that the Halsteads were troublemakers, not to be trusted. Roy had been angry at Sarah for months. Angry that she'd put them in that position, made them pariahs in their own community. It wasn't until years later that he'd learned the truth. One of those workers had been sending money home to support a disabled daughter. The back wages Sarah secured meant the girl could afford the medical care she needed. Sarah had known. She'd known it wasn't just about principle, it was about real people, real consequences. And Roy had been angry at her for caring. The memory burned now. How many other times had he chosen comfort over courage? How many times had Sarah been the strong one while he hid behind practicality? He got up, unable to lie still any longer. Found the cardboard box in the corner? Pulled out Sarah's letters. She'd written him one every year on their anniversary, even though they lived in the same house. 29 letters total. He'd only read even though they lived in the same house. 29 letters total. He'd only read each one once, on the day she'd given it to him. Now he read them all, one after another, sitting at the kitchen table as the night deepened around him. The 20th anniversary letter was the one that broke him. Sarah's handwriting, steady and clear. 20 years, my love. 20 years of building a life together, and I couldn't be prouder of what we've made. But I want you to know something, and I hope you'll hear it in the spirit it's meant. You're a good man, Roy Halstead, but you're capable of being a great man. I see it in you, that fire, that strength. You hide it away because you're afraid of what it might cost. But standing up for what's right is never wrong, even when it costs us. I'd rather live 1 year doing right than 100 years looking away. I married you because I saw that greatness in you. I'm still waiting for you to see it in yourself. Roy's hands shook as he held the letter. She'd written it 9 years before she died. She'd been waiting all that time for him to become the man she believed he could be. And he never had. He'd kept playing it safe, kept choosing the easy path, right up until the moment a dust storm took her away, and he'd never have the chance to be better. Except he did have the chance. Right now, right here. Those 6 men in the river were giving him the chance Sarah had been waiting for. This fight against Clearwater wasn't just about justice for strangers. It was about finally becoming the man his wife had seen in him, the man she'd deserved to be married to. Roy carefully folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket, right next to her photograph. From now on, he'd carry both, reminders of what he was fighting for and who he was fighting to become. As dawn broke, Roy made his decision. No more half measures, no more testing the waters. He was going all in. He'd meet Miguel tomorrow night, get the map of the mining camp. Then he'd break into that office and get the logbook. He'd gather every piece of evidence he could. And then he'd hand it all to Ellen Graves and watch Clearwater burn. He spent the day preparing. Checked his rifle. He wouldn't take it to the mining camp, but he wanted it clean and ready in case trouble came to his door. Organized his evidence. The water samples, the photographs he'd taken of the culvert pipe, notes from his conversation with Miguel. Put it all in a waterproof bag and hid it in a place only Ellen knew about. If something happened to him, she could still use it. He wrote a letter, too. Just a simple statement. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. What follows is everything I know about Clearwater Mining Company and the murder of 6 workers. He sealed it in an envelope and gave it to Ellen when she stopped by that afternoon. You're really going through with this, she said. Not quite a question. I am. You know it's probably a trap, right? This Miguel character, he could be setting you up. The company might know you're coming. Maybe, but I've got to try. Ellen studied him for a long moment. What changed? When you first found those bodies, you looked like a man who just wanted to be left alone. Now you look like a man with purpose. Roy touched the pocket where Sarah's letter rested. I spent most of my life being afraid. Afraid of conflict, afraid of consequences, afraid of standing out. It got me exactly nowhere. My wife Sarah, she was never afraid. She stood up every time for everyone who needed it. I used to think she was reckless. Now I understand she was brave. And I'd like to be brave at least once before I die. Brave or stupid, Ellen said. But there was respect in her voice. Maybe both. Is there a difference? She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Not really. All right, Roy Halstead. You go be brave, but you be careful too. The world needs more men like you, not fewer. After she left, Roy sat with Junebug in the corral. The mare nuzzled his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. What do you think, girl? He murmured. Am I crazy? Junebug had no answer, but her presence was comforting, solid, real. She'd been Sarah's horse, and Sarah had loved her like family. Roy ran his hand down her neck, feeling the strength in her, the life. "I'm going to make this right," he said. "For those men, for Sarah, for everyone who ever got stepped on by people with more power and less conscience. I know I can't win, but I can fight, and sometimes fighting is enough." The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The river flowed past, still carrying its poison, but maybe not for much longer. If Roy succeeded, if he could expose what Clearwater was doing, that contamination would stop. The river would heal. Life would return to normal, and if he failed, at least he'd have tried. At least he'd have stood up. At least Sarah would have been proud. Roy went inside and made himself a simple dinner. Beans and bread, coffee strong enough to strip paint. He ate slowly, savoring it. Tomorrow night, he'd either have the evidence he needed, or he'd be dead. Either way, this was likely his last quiet evening. He pulled out all of Sarah's letters again, reading them one more time. She'd loved him. Through all his failings and fears, she'd loved him. And she'd believed in him. That belief was worth more than any fortune, more valuable than any amount of safety. "I'm ready," he said to her photograph. "I'm finally ready to be the man you married. Better late than never, right?" The photograph smiled back at him, frozen in time, forever 45. Forever standing in front of the barn that the storm would later destroy. Forever unaware of what was coming. But if she'd known, if she'd seen all of it, the storm and the death and Roy's years of grief, Sarah wouldn't have changed a thing. She would have faced it all with that same courage she'd shown every day of her life. And now, finally, Roy would do the same. He lay down to rest, not really sleeping, just conserving strength. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Tomorrow he'd drive to the old grain elevator and meet Miguel. Tomorrow he'd get the layout of the mining camp. And tomorrow night, under cover of darkness, Roy Halstead would break into the office of a company that had killed 6 men and wouldn't hesitate to make it 7. He wasn't afraid. That was the strange thing. He'd spent 61 years being afraid, and now, facing the most dangerous thing he'd ever done, fear had left him. In its place was clarity, purpose, the solid certainty that he was doing what needed to be done. If this was how his story ended, so be it. At least it would be a story worth telling. At least he'd have mattered, at least for once in his life. Roy Halstead would have stood up. The old grain elevator stood like a tombstone against the night sky, 3 stories of concrete and rust, abandoned for decades. Roy arrived early, parking his truck behind the structure where it wouldn't be visible from the road. The moon was 3/4 full, giving enough light to see by, but enough darkness to hide in. Miguel appeared at exactly 10 o'clock, materializing from the shadows. He moved quick and nervous, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding area. "You came. Said I would. I wasn't sure. Thought maybe you'd come to your senses. Decided an old man's life was worth more than revenge. It's not revenge. It's justice." "There's a difference." Miguel handed him a folded piece of paper. "That's the layout. The office trailer is here," he pointed, "on the north side of the compound. Usually there's a guard at the main gate, but the north fence is broken in 2 places. You can get through there. What about the logbook? Victor Caldwell keeps it in his desk. Top drawer, right side. It's got everything. Dates, amounts dumped, workers who complained. He documents it all to protect himself if the company tries to make him the fall guy." Roy studied the map, committing it to memory. "This is good intel. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. If you get caught, I never saw you. I don't know you. Understand?" "I understand. What about you? Where will you go?" "Back to Mexico. Got family there. I can disappear, start over. But first..." Miguel hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket. A photograph, creased and worn. "One of the men you found. His name was Carlos. Carlos Mendoza. He was my cousin." Roy took the photograph. A young man, maybe 25, smiling at the camera. Dark hair, honest eyes, his arm around an older woman, his mother, probably. The world suddenly felt heavier. These weren't just bodies. They were Carlos and 5 others like him. Men with names, families, futures that had been stolen. I'm sorry, Roy said. Just make sure people know what happened to him. That's all I'm asking. Miguel's voice cracked slightly. He was a good man. He deserved better. I'll make sure. You have my word. Miguel nodded once, then disappeared back into the shadows. Roy stood alone, the photograph in his hand, the weight of responsibility settling over him like a cloak. This wasn't abstract anymore. This was Carlos Mendoza, who'd had a mother who loved him, a cousin who mourned him, a life that mattered. Roy was folding the map when headlights swept across the grain elevator. He pressed himself against the concrete wall, heart hammering. A vehicle pulled up, not a car, but a truck. A white truck he recognized. Sheriff Dawkins climbed out, followed by another man. In the moonlight, Roy could make out the second man's features. Late 40s, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone used to authority. They spoke in low voices, too quiet for Roy to hear from his position. But then Dawkins raised his voice, angry about something. Told you we had it handled. Now you've got this old fool poking around asking questions. He's already talked to that journalist. We're dealing with it, the other man said, his voice calm but cold. Halstead will be handled. Just like the others. Roy's blood ran cold. They were talking about him, and they were planning to kill him, just like they'd killed Carlos and the others. He needed to hear more, needed evidence. His hand went to the phone Ellen had given him. It had a voice recorder. Moving carefully, silently, Roy edged closer to where the two men stood. The problem, the well-dressed man continued, is that we waited too long. Should have dealt with him the night he found the bodies. Now he's a liability. He's got evidence, he's got testimony, and worse, he's got conviction. Those are the dangerous ones, the ones with nothing to lose. So what do you want me to do? Make it look like an accident. House fire, maybe. He's old, probably fell asleep with the stove on. Tragic, but not suspicious. Can you do that? There was a pause. Then Dawkins said, voice tight, yeah, I can do that. Good. Tonight, preferably. And find out what he's given to the journalist. We need to know how much damage control we're looking at. The well-dressed man handed Dawkins an envelope, thick, probably full of cash. Your usual retainer, plus a bonus for handling this quickly. Roy's hands shook as he held the phone, recording every word. This was it, the proof Ellen needed. The sheriff of Copperwells County was on camera, well, audio, accepting payment to commit murder, to cover up the deaths of 6 workers. This was enough to bring in federal authorities, enough to bypass the local corruption. But first, Roy had to survive the night. He waited until both men got back in their vehicles and drove away, the sheriff heading toward town, the other man going north, probably back to the mining camp. Then Roy ran to his truck, his mind racing. He couldn't go home. They were planning to burn his house tonight. He needed to get to Ellen, give her the recording, make sure it was in safe hands before they could silence him. But where was Ellen? She'd given him her number, but not her address. Roy drove toward Copperwells, staying off the main roads. He called Ellen's number on the prepaid phone. It rang 4 times, 5. Come on, answer. Hello? Ellen, it's Roy. We've got a problem. Big problem. What happened? I recorded Sheriff Dawkins accepting payment from the mining company. They're planning to kill me tonight. Make it look like a house fire. Silence. Then, where are you right now? On my way to town. Where can I meet you? There's a motel on Highway 12, just past the junction. The Starlight. I'm in room 7. Get there as fast as you can. Roy hung up and pressed the accelerator. His old truck rattled and complained, but it moved. 20 minutes later, he pulled into the motel parking lot. A sad collection of 8 rooms with peeling paint and neon that hadn't worked in years. Ellen's door opened before he could knock. Get in here, she said, pulling him inside. The room was a command center. Papers covered the bed, the desk, taped to the walls. Photos, documents, maps. Ellen had been building her case for 5 years, and it showed. Roy handed her the phone. It's all on there. The sheriff taking money to commit murder. Planning to burn my house. Talking about covering up the workers' deaths. Ellen listened to the recording 3 times, her expression growing more intense with each play. Finally, she looked up. This is it. This is what we needed. With this, I can go to the FBI. They'll have to investigate. Good. Do it tonight. Because by morning I might be dead. You can't go back to your property. I wasn't planning to. But I need to get Junebug, my horse. She's alone there, and if they burn the place, Roy, it's too dangerous. They're probably there already. Then I'll go careful. But I'm not leaving her to die in a fire. She's all I have left of Sarah. Ellen started to argue, then saw something in his face that stopped her. Fine, but I'm coming with you. And we bring insurance. She pulled out a laptop, logged into an encrypted email, and began typing. I'm sending this recording to 3 different people. My lawyer, my old editor, and a contact at the EPA. If anything happens to either of us, they all have instructions to release everything immediately. That should keep you alive. Clearwater kills you now. The recording goes public and they're finished. Smart. That's why I'm still breathing after 5 years chasing this story. Ellen hit send, then closed the laptop. Okay, let's go get your horse. They took Ellen's car, less recognizable than Roy's truck. The drive to his property took 35 minutes, every mile stretching Roy's nerves tighter. What if they'd already burned it? What if Junebug was already no? He couldn't think that way. Had to believe there was still time. They parked a quarter-mile down the road and approached on foot. The house was dark, but Roy could see shapes moving near the corral. 2 men carrying gas cans. His blood ran cold. Stay here, he whispered to Ellen. Like hell. We do this together. They circled wide, using the darkness and the terrain. As they got closer, Roy could see the men more clearly. One was young, maybe mid-20s, with the build of someone who worked security. The other was older, harder, probably the one who'd give the orders. They were arguing in low voices. Just torch the house. The old man's not even here, Caldwell said to make sure. Check inside first. Then we set it. Fine, you check. I'll start spreading gas around the corral. Roy's jaw clenched. They were going to burn Junebug alive. Not because she was a threat, but because she was his, and they wanted to hurt him. Wanted to take everything. Not this time. He moved before Ellen could stop him, stepping out of the shadows. Evening, gentlemen. Looking for me. Both men spun. The younger one dropped his gas can, hand going to his belt, probably for a weapon. The older one was faster, already pulling a pistol. Mr. Halstead, saved us the trouble of tracking you down. I'll make this simple, Roy said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. You're being recorded right now. Everything you say, everything you do, it's being live-streamed to federal authorities. You shoot me, it's on camera. You burn my property, it's on camera. So I suggest you put that gun down and walk away while you still can. It was a complete bluff. They weren't being recorded, but these men didn't know that. The older one hesitated, his eyes darting around trying to spot cameras. The younger one looked panicked. Boss said nothing about cameras. Shut up, the older one snapped. Then to Roy, you're lying. Maybe I am. You willing to bet your freedom on it? Because the FBI is very interested in a mining company that murders workers and bribes sheriffs. You kill me, you become part of a federal case. Is that what you want? Behind him, Ellen stepped out of the shadows holding her phone up. Actually, we are recording. Hi there. Wave to the camera. That did it. The younger man bolted, running for his truck. The older one looked between Roy and Ellen, weighing his options, then lowered his pistol. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Roy said. It's over for Clearwater. Over for Sheriff Dawkins. Over for everyone who thought they could kill working men and get away with it. The only question is whether you go down with them or you cooperate and save yourself. The man spat on the ground, then turned and walked away. Roy heard truck engines start, vehicles pulling away into the night. He stood there shaking, the adrenaline finally catching up to him. Ellen put a hand on his shoulder. Nice bluff. We were actually recording. Yeah, from the moment you stepped out. Got the whole thing. Them with gas cans, the guns, the threats. This is federal evidence now. Roy walked to the corral. Junebug stood in the shadows, ears alert. When she saw him, she nickered softly and came to the fence. Roy put his arms around her neck, burying his face in her mane. It's okay, girl. You're safe. We're all safe now. But even as he said it, Roy knew it wasn't quite true. They'd won this round, but the war wasn't over. Clearwater would come back harder. And next time, Roy might not be so lucky. They couldn't stay at Roy's property, and they couldn't stay at Ellen's motel in Copper Wells. Too exposed. Too easy for Clearwater to find them. So they drove 40 miles east to the next county, checking into a roadside motel that asked no questions and accepted cash. Ellen paid for 2 rooms, but they worked from one, spreading their evidence across every available surface. Water samples lined up on the dresser, each labeled with location and date. Photographs covered the bed, the bodies in the reeds, the culvert pipe dumping waste, the mining camp from a distance. Roy's recording of Sheriff Dawkins played on loop from Ellen's laptop, each word another nail in the coffin they were building. "We need to organize this," Ellen said, her journalist's mind taking over. "Presented in a way that's undeniable. Water samples showing contamination. Photos proving the source. Audio of the sheriff admitting to the cover-up. Testimony from you about finding the bodies. And we need more. We need company records, proof they knew what they were doing." Roy thought about the logbook Miguel had mentioned. The foreman keeps records. Documents everything to protect himself. Can you still get it? After tonight, they'll be expecting me. Security will be tight. Ellen leaned back against the wall, thinking. Then we need leverage. Something that makes them come to us instead of us going to them. She pulled out a folder Roy hadn't seen before. Inside were documents, printed emails, handwritten notes. "I told you I investigated Clearwater 5 years ago. What I didn't tell you was why I got so obsessed with it." She laid out a photograph. A young man, early 30s, with Ellen's eyes and her determined expression. "This is my brother Marcus. He was a journalist too. Freelance, mostly environmental work. 5 years ago, he came out here to investigate reports of worker deaths at Clearwater. He was here for 2 months, gathering evidence, interviewing people. Then one day he just disappeared. Roy's stomach dropped. The bodies I found, I don't know. I've never seen him since. Never found a body. The sheriff said he probably just moved on, went to his next story. But Marcus would never have done that. He'd have called. He'd have finished what he started." Ellen's voice was steady, but Roy could hear the pain underneath. "I came here a year later looking for answers. Found his motel room. His laptop was gone, his notes were gone, but hidden in the bathroom vent I found this." She unfolded a piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was a hand-drawn map, incredibly detailed. The river running through it like a vein, and marked along its length 9 locations, each one labeled with a date and a number. "Dump sites," Roy said quietly. 9 locations where Clearwater was dumping toxic waste directly into the river. Marcus documented everything. Dates, estimated volumes, water samples. This map was going to be the centerpiece of his exposé. But he never got to publish it because someone made sure he couldn't. Roy studied the map. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural. A man who cared about accuracy, about truth. "You think he's one of the bodies I found?" "I think it's possible. The timing fits. 6 bodies, but Marcus makes 7. There could be more we haven't found yet." Ellen's hands were shaking slightly as she refolded the map. "So yes, this is personal for me. This isn't just about justice for workers I never met. This is about my little brother who believed in something enough to die for it. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Help me finish what he started." Roy nodded. "What do we do?" "We go public. Not just to the FBI, to everyone. I contact every news outlet I have connections with. Television, print, online. We release everything we have simultaneously. The recordings, the photos, the map. Make it so big that Clearwater can't suppress it. Can't pay it off. Can't make it disappear. That'll make us targets. We're already targets. At least this way, our deaths would be obviously suspicious. They can't kill us once we're headline news, without drawing even more attention." Ellen pulled out her phone and started making calls. First to the FBI field office in Phoenix, then to the State Environmental Protection Agency, then to a lawyer she knew who specialized in environmental crimes. Each conversation was precise, laying out the evidence, arranging meetings, building the case. Roy listened, impressed by her professionalism. She wasn't emotional or vengeful. She was methodical, building an airtight case brick by brick. This was someone who'd spent 5 years preparing for this moment. While Ellen worked the phone, Roy went to check on Junebug. He'd brought her in the trailer, not willing to leave her behind again. She stood in the motel parking lot, tied to a post, munching hay. When she saw Roy, she nickered softly. "Hey, girl," he said, running his hand down her neck. "You saved my life, you know that? If you'd drunk from that river, I never would have investigated. Never would have found those men. You've got better instincts than I do." Junebug pushed her nose against his chest, and Roy wrapped his arms around her, taking comfort in her solid presence. Sarah had loved this horse, had ridden her every weekend, talking to her like she was people. And now Junebug was all Roy had left of that life, a living connection to the woman he'd lost. Sarah would have been proud of this, he said quietly. "All of it. Standing up, fighting back. I spent so long being afraid, being careful. Took me 61 years and losing everything to finally understand what she was trying to teach me. Better late than never, right?" Junebug had no answer, but her presence was answer enough. Some things didn't need words. Roy was heading back to the room when he spotted them. 2 vehicles, black SUVs with tinted windows, pulling into the motel parking lot. They moved slowly, deliberately, like predators stalking prey. He ran. "Ellen, we've got company!" She looked up from her phone, saw his face, and immediately started gathering evidence. Roy helped her, shoving everything into a backpack. The photographs, the water samples, the map, Ellen's laptop. 30 seconds, maybe less. The SUVs were parking. "Back window," Ellen said. "Now!" They climbed through, dropping into the alley behind the motel. Roy could hear car doors opening, footsteps on concrete, men's voices calling out. They were checking the rooms. "This way," Roy whispered. They ran toward where he'd parked his truck, the backpack bouncing against Ellen's shoulders. Behind them, he heard a door being kicked in. Shouting, someone had found the empty room. They reached the truck. Roy climbed in, Ellen beside him, and he fired the engine. The trailer with Junebug was still attached. No time to unhitch it. He pulled out of the parking lot just as men emerged from behind the motel, pointing, shouting into radios. "Drive!" Ellen yelled. Roy drove. East, away from Copper Wells, away from Clearwater. The road was dark and empty, his headlights cutting through the night. Behind them, headlights appeared. The SUVs following. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore," Ellen said. "This is open intimidation. What do we do?" "We get to the FBI office in Phoenix. It's 3 hours from here. We make it there, we're safe. They can't touch us on federal property. 3 hours." With Clearwater's men following them. Roy pressed the accelerator down, his old truck protesting but responding. The speedometer climbed 60, 70, 80. The SUVs kept pace. They drove for an hour, the tension building with every mile. The SUVs stayed back about 100 yards, just close enough to keep them in sight. Playing with them, Roy realized. They could have forced them off the road any time. They were choosing not to, herding them, waiting for the right moment. "They're going to try something," Roy said. "Once we get off the highway into less populated areas, they'll make their move. Then we don't get off the highway. We stay on main roads, busy roads. Make it harder for them." But eventually, they had to take the exit for Phoenix. The highway became a 2-lane road cutting through desert. Darkness pressed in from all sides. The SUVs closed the distance. Roy saw it coming a second before it happened. One SUV accelerated, pulling alongside. The other moved to block them from behind. They were boxing them in. "Hold on," Roy said. He slammed the brakes. The truck shuddered, the trailer fishtailing. The SUVs shot past them, their drivers not expecting the maneuver. Roy swung the wheel, turning onto a side road, barely more than a dirt track. The truck bounced over ruts, Junebug whinnying in the trailer. "Where are we going?" Ellen shouted over the noise. "I don't know. Anywhere but here." Behind them, the SUVs had turned around, following. But the dirt road was narrow and rough. Roy's old truck, built for ranch work, handled it better than their fancy vehicles. The gap widened. They drove for 20 minutes, winding through desert scrub, until Roy saw lights ahead. A gas station, old and isolated, but with a few cars parked outside. People, witnesses, safety. He pulled in, parking directly under the brightest light. The SUVs stopped at the edge of the parking lot, but didn't approach. "Too many potential witnesses now. We can't stay here," Ellen said. "Eventually they'll either wait us out or come anyway," Roy was thinking. "Call the FBI, tell them where we are." Ask for an escort to Phoenix. If they're serious about investigating, they'll send agents. Ellen made the call. Spoke urgently into the phone for 5 minutes. Finally, she hung up. They're sending someone. 2 hours? Can we last 2 hours? We don't have a choice. They went inside the gas station. The clerk, an elderly man reading a newspaper, barely looked up. Roy bought coffee, using the time to watch the SUVs through the window. They hadn't moved, just waiting. He thought about how far he'd come. A month ago, he'd been ready to die quietly, to let grief consume him. Now he was running from hired killers, fighting to expose corporate corruption, becoming the kind of man Sarah had always believed he could be. Was he doing this for Carlos Mendoza and the other dead workers? Or was he doing it for himself, to ease his own guilt over a lifetime of looking away? Did it even matter? The result was the same. Justice pursued, truth demanded, evil confronted. Maybe that was the lesson Sarah had tried to teach him all along. Motivation didn't matter as much as action. You could question your reasons forever, but what counted was what you did. Standing up was standing up, regardless of why you started. Ellen sat beside him, sipping coffee, her eyes on the SUVs. When this is over, if we survive, I'm writing the biggest story of my career. Marcus's story. Your story. The workers' story. Everything. Good. They deserve to be remembered. So do you. Roy shook his head. I'm just an old cowboy who found something wrong and couldn't let it go. That's called being a hero, Roy. Heroes are people who risk something valuable. I didn't have anything left to lose. You had your life. That's always worth something. And you chose to risk it anyway. That's what makes it brave. They sat in silence, drinking bad coffee, watching the clock. 1 hour passed, then 90 minutes. The SUVs remained, patient and predatory. Finally, headlights approached from the direction of Phoenix. 2 unmarked sedans driving with purpose. They pulled into the gas station, and 4 people in dark suits climbed out. FBI agents, badges visible. The SUVs, seeing the federal presence, pulled away into the night, disappearing like they'd never been there. One of the agents approached Roy and Ellen. Mr. Halstead, Ms. Graves? I'm Agent Sarah Chen. We spoke on the phone. I understand you have evidence of criminal activity related to Clearwater Mining Company. Roy looked at Ellen. She nodded. He handed over the backpack. Everything's in there. Water samples showing illegal contamination. Photos of the dump sites. Recordings of the county sheriff accepting bribes to commit murder. And a map showing 5 years of systematic environmental crimes. Agent Chen's expression didn't change, but Roy saw the intensity in her eyes. We'll need your full statements, both of you. And we'll need you to testify when this goes to trial. We'll do whatever it takes, Roy said. Just make sure those men get justice. Make sure their families know what happened. Make sure Clearwater pays for what they've done. That's exactly what we intend to do, Agent Chen said. Mr. Halstead, Ms. Graves, as of now, you're both under federal protection. No one's going to hurt you. You have my word. Roy felt something release in his chest. Relief, maybe. Or vindication. Or just the simple satisfaction of knowing he'd done what he set out to do. He'd stood up. He'd fought back. And he'd won, not completely, not yet. There would be trials, testimonies, battles ahead. But the truth was out now. Clearwater couldn't suppress it. The families would have answers. Justice would eventually be served. Sarah would have been proud, and for the first time since her death 3 years ago, Roy felt like maybe, just maybe, he could be proud of himself too. The FBI put Roy and Ellen in protective custody, but 3 days later, Roy received a phone call that changed everything. It came through Agent Chen, who looked uncomfortable delivering the message. Victor Caldwell wants to meet with you, she said. He claims he wants to negotiate. Negotiate what? He wouldn't say. But he's offering to come alone, unarmed, to a location of your choosing. He says he has information that could help your case, but he'll only give it to you directly. Roy looked at Ellen, who'd been sitting beside him reviewing documents. It's a trap, she said immediately. Probably, Agent Chen agreed. But it might also be legitimate. Sometimes when these cases go federal, people start trying to cut deals. Caldwell might be looking to save himself by turning on the parent company. Or he might be looking to silence the only witness who can put him at the scene of a murder. Ellen countered. Roy thought about it. Victor Caldwell, the man Miguel had identified as the foreman who ran the night operations. The man who'd ordered the dumping. The man who'd made workers disappear. If there was any chance of getting a confession from him, a recorded admission of guilt, it would seal the case completely. "I'll do it," Roy said. "Roy," Ellen started, "but I'd do it wired. Full recording equipment. And I want FBI agents close by, ready to move in if things go bad." Agent Chen nodded. "We can arrange that. And Mr. Halstead, if he tries anything, you give the signal and we'll be there in seconds." The meeting was set for noon the next day at an abandoned rest stop off Highway 10, 50 miles from Copper Wells, remote enough to satisfy Caldwell's paranoia, public enough that the FBI could position teams nearby without being obvious. They fitted Roy with a wire, a small recording device hidden under his shirt, so sensitive it would pick up a whisper from 20 feet away. Agent Chen walked him through the signals. If he scratched his left ear, they'd move in immediately. If he said the phrase, "I need to think about it," same thing. Otherwise, they'd stay back and let him work. Ellen wanted to come, but Agent Chen vetoed it. "Too risky. If Caldwell sees more than Mr. Halstead, he'll spook. We need him comfortable enough to talk." So Roy went alone, driving his truck with Junebug in the trailer. He still wasn't willing to leave her anywhere unguarded. The rest stop appeared abandoned from the outside. Cracked pavement, weeds growing through the concrete, a bathroom building with the doors hanging off their hinges. But Roy knew federal agents were positioned in the surrounding brush, watching through scopes. He parked and waited. At exactly noon, a black sedan pulled in. Victor Caldwell climbed out. The same man Roy had seen talking to Sheriff Dawkins that night by the grain elevator. Late 40s, well-dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt. He looked like a businessman, not a killer. But Roy knew better. Monsters rarely looked monstrous. Caldwell walked over, his hands visible and empty. "Mr. Halstead, thank you for agreeing to meet. You said you wanted to negotiate." "I do, may I?" Caldwell gestured to the picnic table under a rusted awning. Roy nodded, and they both sat. Caldwell laid out his pitch smoothly, like he'd rehearsed it. "You're in a difficult position. You've made accusations against a major corporation, accusations that could cost Clearwater millions in fines, possibly shut down operations entirely. That affects a lot of people, workers who need jobs, families who depend on those paychecks, local businesses that rely on the mine's presence. 6 men are dead," Roy said flatly. "Yes, a tragedy. But pursuing this case won't bring them back. What it will do is destroy an industry that supports hundreds of families. So I'm here to offer you an alternative." Caldwell pulled an envelope from his pocket, set it on the table. $100,000, cash, tax-free. You take it, drop your testimony, and walk away. We'll say there was a misunderstanding. The bodies were from an unrelated incident. The water samples were contaminated by natural causes. Everyone moves on. Roy stared at the envelope. $100,000. More money than he'd see in 5 years of ranching. Enough to rebuild his life, buy new property, start over for real. All he had to do was look away. Forget what he'd seen. Let 6 dead men stay forgotten. What about their families? He asked quietly. What families? These men were illegals, transients. They have no families looking for them. No one who cares. They're ghosts, Mr. Halstead. You can't get justice for ghosts. Everyone has someone who cares. Carlos Mendoza had a mother, had a cousin, had people who loved him. Caldwell's expression flickered with something, surprise maybe, that Roy knew a name. Carlos was going to report us to the EPA. He was going to destroy everything we'd built here. He made a choice, and choices have consequences. So you killed him. I protected the company's interests. That's my job. The admission hung in the air between them. Roy forced himself to stay calm, to keep Caldwell talking. And the others? The other 5 men I found. They were going to report you too. They were going to testify. They'd seen the dumping, understood what it meant. We couldn't allow that. Caldwell leaned forward, his voice reasonable, almost friendly. Listen, I'm not a bad man. This is just business. You dispose of waste the legal way. It costs tens of thousands per week. You dump it in the river at night, it costs nothing. The company saves money, stays profitable, keeps people employed. Is it technically illegal? Sure, but who's it hurting? Some fish? Some plants? They're not people. The workers who died, they were people. They were liabilities. Look, Mr. Halstead, I don't expect you to like what we did, but I need you to understand it was necessary. And I need you to be reasonable about this. $100,000. Take it. Disappear. Let this go. Roy looked at the envelope, then back at Caldwell. You're saying you murdered 6 men to cover up illegal dumping. That's what you're admitting to me right now. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. I'm saying I protected the company, however necessary. And yes, that included making sure certain people couldn't testify. He smiled, cold and confident. But you can't prove any of this. It's your word against mine. And you're a nobody, Mr. Halstead, a washed-up rancher with nothing to lose. Who's going to believe you? Everyone, Roy said quietly. Everyone's going to believe me. Because you just confessed to everything on tape. Caldwell's face went white. What? Roy tapped his chest, where the recording device sat hidden. Every word, recorded and being transmitted to the FBI right now. Your admission of illegal dumping. Your admission of murdering 6 workers. All of it. For a long moment, Caldwell just stared. Then his expression shifted from shock to rage. He stood abruptly, the table scraping across concrete. You son of a... 2 men emerged from behind the bathroom building. Security. Probably the same ones who'd tried to burn Roy's property. Caldwell gestured sharply. Get that device! Get it now. The men moved toward Roy. He stood his ground, his hand moving to scratch his left ear. The signal. But before he could complete it, Caldwell pulled a pistol from behind his back. Nobody moves, Caldwell said, his voice shaking with fury. Nobody moves or the old man dies right here. The security men froze. Roy froze. In the distance, he could hear engines starting, the FBI responding. But would they get here in time? Caldwell advanced on Roy, the pistol steady in his hand. You stupid old fool. You could have walked away. Could have lived. Now you're going to die in the middle of nowhere, and everyone will think it was just another accident. Roy looked at the gun, then at Caldwell's eyes, and saw something there he recognized, desperation. This wasn't a confident killer. This was a man backed into a corner, making one last desperate move. And desperate men made mistakes. You shoot me, Roy said calmly, and you guarantee a murder conviction. The FBI heard everything. They're on their way right now. You've already lost, Caldwell. The only question is whether you make it worse. I make it worse. Caldwell laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. How much worse can it get? I'm finished. The company's finished. Everything I worked for, 6 men died, Roy interrupted. That's what matters. Not your career, not the company, them. And you're going to face justice for what you did to them. Caldwell's hand shook. The pistol wavered. And in that moment, Roy knew he'd won. Not by fighting, but by refusing to back down. By standing for something bigger than himself. The FBI vehicles roared into the rest stop, agents spilling out with weapons drawn. Drop the weapon, FBI! Caldwell looked around, trapped, outnumbered. The pistol fell from his hand, clattering on the concrete. He sank to his knees, hands on his head, all the fight gone out of him. Roy stood watching as they cuffed Caldwell, reading him his rights. The recording device under his shirt had captured everything. The confession. The threats, all of it. Clearwater Mining Company was finished. And 6 dead workers would finally get justice. Agent Chen approached. That was reckless, Mr. Halstead. Maybe, Roy said. But it worked. It did. Victor Caldwell just handed us everything we need to prosecute not just him, but the entire corporate chain. This case is airtight now. Roy watched them lead Caldwell away, the man who'd ordered the deaths of Carlos Mendoza and 5 others. The man who'd thought he could buy his way out of consequences. The man who'd finally learned that some things couldn't be bought. Justice, truth, human dignity, those things, Roy had learned, were priceless. The days following Victor Caldwell's arrest moved with the unstoppable momentum of an avalanche. Within 12 hours, the FBI had executed search warrants at Clearwater Mining Company's offices, seizing computers, documents, financial records. The evidence Roy and Ellen had gathered became the foundation of the largest environmental and labor crime investigation in the state's history. Roy watched it unfold from the FBI's field office in Phoenix, where he and Ellen remained under protective custody. Agent Chen kept them updated, her professional demeanor occasionally cracking to reveal something like satisfaction. "Sheriff Dawkins was arrested this morning," she announced on the second day. "Conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, accepting bribes. He's looking at 20 years minimum." "Good," Ellen said simply. "The EPA is conducting emergency testing of the entire river system. Preliminary results show contamination levels 10 times the legal limit for heavy metals. They're issuing notices to every resident within 5 miles of the river. No drinking, no bathing, no fishing. It's a full environmental disaster." Roy thought about Junebug refusing to drink. "How long until it's clean?" "Years, maybe decades, depending on how much was dumped. But the cleanup starts now. Clearwater's parent company is going to pay for every cent of it. We've frozen their assets." The news broke on the third day. Ellen's story hit every major outlet simultaneously: television, newspapers, online. The headline read, "6 workers die after mining company dumps toxic waste. Sheriff covered it up." Ellen's byline appeared beneath it, along with Roy's name as the primary witness. Roy watched himself on the evening news. Footage taken from outside the FBI office. The reporter called him a hero and a whistleblower who risked everything for justice. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired, worn thin by the constant interviews and statements and depositions. But he kept going, because the story was bigger than his exhaustion. On the 4th day, they began identifying the bodies. DNA testing, fingerprints, dental records. The FBI brought in forensic teams. Carlos Mendoza was confirmed first. His mother was notified, and she flew in from Mexico, a small woman in her 60s with Carlos's same honest eyes. Roy met her at the FBI office, Ellen translating. "Thank you," Carlos's mother said through tears. "Thank you for not letting him be forgotten. For giving me answers, for making his death mean something." Roy couldn't speak. He just held her hand while she wept, feeling the weight of her grief mixed with gratitude. This was why he'd fought. Not for glory or recognition, but for this, a mother finally knowing what happened to her son. The other 5 were identified over the next week. Each had families, each had people who'd been searching, wondering, hoping. The FBI contacted them all, and one by one they came to claim their loved ones, to finally lay them to rest with dignity. Ellen was there for all of it, documenting everything, turning her brother's unfinished investigation into a comprehensive exposé of corporate exploitation. Because they found Marcus too. His body had been separate from the others, buried in a different location near the mining camp. Ellen identified him through a photograph, and Roy held her while she grieved for the brother she'd lost 5 years ago. "He knew," she said through her tears. "He knew what they were doing, and they killed him for it. But we finished his work. He didn't die for nothing." The federal investigation expanded. The EPA announced a formal inquiry into Clearwater's operations across all 7 states where they had mines. Documents seized from the Phoenix office showed the illegal dumping wasn't isolated. It was company policy, approved at the highest levels. The CEO was subpoenaed. Board members were questioned. Clearwater Mining Company's stock price collapsed. By the end of the second week, 3 executives had been indicted on federal charges. 17 local officials across 3 counties were under investigation for accepting bribes. The entire corporate structure was unraveling, thread by thread, victim by victim, crime by crime. Roy gave his deposition on day 16. 8 hours of testimony, every detail recorded and transcribed. He told them about finding the bodies, about Junebug refusing the water, about Miguel and the culvert pipe and the logbook. He told them about Sheriff Dawkins's warning, about the threatening note, about Victor Caldwell's confession. He held nothing back. When it was done, Agent Chen shook his hand. "That was good testimony, Mr. Halstead. When this goes to trial, you'll need to repeat it. Are you prepared for that?" I'll do whatever's needed. It could take years. Appeals, delays, legal maneuvering. This won't be quick or easy. Justice rarely is. Ellen's story won awards. She was hired by a major network to develop a documentary. Advocacy groups reached out, asking Roy and Ellen to speak at conferences, to share their story. The quiet life Roy had sought when he bought that river property seemed impossibly distant now. But as the media frenzy gradually subsided and the legal machinery ground on, Roy found himself thinking not about what he'd done, but about what it had cost. He was exhausted, not just physically, though his body ached in ways he'd never felt before. He was exhausted in his soul, worn down by the constant attention, the endless questions, the weight of being responsible for bringing down an entire company. Late one night, sitting alone in the FBI office while Ellen slept, Roy pulled out Sarah's photograph. He'd carried it through everything: the investigation, the chase, the confrontation with Caldwell. It was creased now, the edges worn, but her smile remained unchanged. "I did it," he whispered. "I stood up, I fought. I didn't look away. Are you proud of me now?" The photograph, as always, didn't answer. But in the silence, Roy felt something settle inside him. A sense of completion, maybe, or resolution. He'd spent 3 years running from Sarah's death, from his guilt over not being there, from the weight of a life half-lived. This fight against Clearwater had forced him to stop running, to face himself, to become, finally, the man Sarah had always believed he could be. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't easy. But it was real. Agent Chen found him there an hour later. "You okay, Mr. Halstead?" "Just thinking. About what comes next. What does come next for you?" Roy considered the question. A month ago, his plan had been to die quietly on that river property, letting grief consume him. Now that property was an EPA cleanup site, cordoned off and contaminated. His quiet death had become a public fight. Everything had changed. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I figure I'll keep breathing until I figure it out. That's all any of us can do." Agent Chen sat beside him. "For what it's worth, you made a difference. 6 families have closure. A corrupt system was exposed. A company that thought it was untouchable is being held accountable. That matters, I know. But it doesn't feel like I thought it would. Victory, I mean. I thought there'd be satisfaction. Instead, I just feel tired. That's because you're a decent man, Mr. Halstead. Decent men don't celebrate bringing others to justice. They just do it because it needs doing. Then they move on." Roy nodded slowly. Maybe that was it. Maybe the point wasn't to feel victorious. It was just to do right and then keep living, carrying the weight of it with whatever grace you could manage. Outside, dawn was breaking. Another day. Another step toward justice, slow and imperfect as it was. Roy stood, tucking Sarah's photograph back in his pocket. He had testimony to give, cases to support, stories to tell. And somewhere, when all this was finally over, he had a life to rebuild, not the life he'd planned, not the quiet death he'd sought, but maybe, just maybe, a life worth living. 6 weeks after Victor Caldwell's arrest, Roy returned to his property. The EPA had declared it safe enough for limited access, though the cleanup would continue for years. The house still stood weathered and worn, but it was home now in a way it hadn't been when he'd first arrived. The river had begun its slow recovery. Water samples showed contamination levels dropping week by week. The EPA had sealed off the culvert pipe, installed monitoring equipment, and started the long process of removing contaminated sediment. It would take time, years probably, but the healing had begun. Roy stood on the bank where he'd found the bodies, looking at the water flowing past. The reeds had been cleared away during the investigation, leaving the spot bare and exposed. It felt wrong, somehow, that place of death having no marker, no acknowledgement of what had happened there. So Roy decided to build one. He bought a stone from a local mason, simple grey granite, nothing fancy. Had it engraved with 7 names: Carlos Mendoza, Miguel Santos, Juan Ramirez, Diego Flores, Antonio Martinez, Rafael Gutierrez, and Marcus Graves. Below their names, a single line: they deserved better. The families came for the dedication. Carlos's mother, small and dignified in black. Miguel Santos's 2 sisters. Juan's elderly father. The others, relatives who'd traveled from Mexico, from Guatemala, from places Roy had never been. And Ellen, representing Marcus, her eyes red but her spine straight. They gathered by the river on a Sunday morning, the sun warm on their shoulders. Roy had never been good at speeches, but he tried. "I didn't know these men," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I never met them, never heard them laugh or saw them work. But I know they mattered. They came here looking for something better, for their families, for themselves. They worked hard. They followed the rules. And when they saw something wrong, they tried to make it right. That took courage. That took honor. And they died because of it." He paused, looking at the stone marker. "We can't bring them back. We can't undo what happened. But we can remember them. We can make sure their deaths weren't meaningless. And we can promise to do better, to build a world where workers aren't disposable, where companies can't murder with impunity, where justice actually means something." Carlos's mother stepped forward and placed flowers on the stone. Then the others, one by one, each leaving something. Flowers, photographs, a rosary, a letter. Miguel's sister thanked Roy in broken English, tears streaming down her face. Juan's father clasped Roy's hand, too overcome to speak. After the ceremony, as people drifted back to their cars, Ellen stayed behind with Roy. "You gave them closure," she said. "That's a gift beyond measure. They gave me something too," Roy said. "Purpose. A reason to keep going. What will you do now?" Roy had been thinking about that. The trials would continue for months, maybe years. He'd need to testify repeatedly. But between court appearances, he had time. He had energy. He had, surprisingly, a future. "I'm going to stay here. Fix up the house properly. Work with migrant advocacy groups. They've been reaching out, asking me to speak, to share what I learned. Help workers understand their rights." He smiled slightly. "Sarah would have liked that. She spent her whole life fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves." "Maybe I can finish what she started," Ellen nodded. "I think she'd be very proud of you, Roy Halstead." After everyone left, Roy walked Junebug down to the river. The mare had been patient throughout the ceremony, standing quiet in the shade. Now she moved carefully down the bank, her hooves finding purchase on the stones. Roy waited, not pushing, letting her decide. Junebug stretched her neck, sniffing the water. For a long moment she stood there, considering. Then she lowered her head and drank. Roy felt tears sting his eyes. It was such a small thing, a horse drinking from a river. But it meant the water was clean enough again. Meant the river was recovering. Meant life was returning to this place that had become a graveyard. "Good girl," he murmured, running his hand along her neck. "You knew, didn't you? You knew something was wrong before any of us did. You saved us all." He thought about the journey that had brought him here. How he'd come to this property broken and hopeless, planning to die quietly. How finding those bodies had pulled him out of his grief and forced him to care again. How fighting for justice for strangers had somehow healed something inside him he didn't know was broken. Sarah had always said that we're not defined by what we lose, but by what we do after. Roy finally understood what she meant. He'd lost his wife, his ranch, his old life. But what he'd done with that loss, standing up, fighting back, refusing to look away, that defined him now. Not the grief, but the response to it. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Roy stood by the memorial stone and pulled out Sarah's photograph one last time. Her smile looked back at him, frozen forever in sunshine. "I did it," he said softly. "I became the man you always believed I could be. Better late than never, right?" He tucked the photograph away, back in his pocket where it had lived for 3 years. But this time, the weight of it felt different. Not like guilt or grief, but like a promise kept. Like love acknowledged. Like a life honored. The river flowed past, clearer now, carrying its water toward some distant ocean. Junebug drank contentedly, her muzzle dripping. And Roy Halstead, 61 years old and finally at peace, realized that he wasn't ready to die after all. He had work to do, stories to tell, justice to pursue. Other workers at other companies had started reaching out, asking for help, sharing their own stories of exploitation and abuse. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun, but this time Roy wasn't fighting alone. And this time, he wasn't fighting from a place of grief and desperation. He was fighting from a place of purpose and hope. Fighting because it was right. Fighting because someone had to. Fighting because, in the end, that's what decent people did. The sun touched the horizon, and Junebug lifted her head, water dripping from her muzzle. She looked at Roy, and in her dark eyes he saw something that might have been approval. Or maybe just contentment. Either way, it was enough. Roy took one last look at the memorial stone, at the 7 names carved in granite. They deserved better, the inscription read. And thanks to one stubborn old cowboy who refused to look away, they'd gotten it. Not everything they deserved. Justice was never perfect, never complete. But something, recognition, dignity, truth. Sarah would have called that a good day's work. Roy called it a life worth living. He climbed back up the bank, Junebug following, and walked toward his house as darkness settled over the land. There was coffee to make, testimony to prepare, phone calls to return from workers who needed help. There was tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days beyond. And for the first time in